Hi, and welcome to our presentation about Maths Talk, Questioning and Dialogue in the New Normal. Watch this video and then we'll meet at one of the live sessions online on the inset day where you'll be able to suggest ideas, ask questions and unpick some of the basic ideas that I'm suggesting here. We're talking about this now because although we might not have to exactly social distance in school in the beginning part of the autumn term, we'll have to have due consideration of how near children are to each other, how they're interacting with each other and hygiene. And in these circumstances, there'll inevitably be the temptation to move away from a collaborative, dialogic approach where a considerable amount of children's learning about maths comes from dialogue and discussion, towards an approach that more closely resembles perhaps chalk and talk, where children are sitting in lines and learning more passively. So to start with, we need to examine firstly why dialogue and discussion are so important in teaching and learning in general. One of the strongest and most enduring sets of ideas about how children learn flow from the work of Lev Vygotsky, and he argued that children develop and learn through engaging with others, children and adults, through the medium of spoken language. And following Vygotsky, Robin Alexander, one of the strongest and most well-known advocates of dialogic teaching, suggested that talk is arguably the true foundation of learning, so pretty important. Another well-known researcher and theorist in this area is Neil Mercer, and he suggests that communication through talk is a way for children and adults to interthink, to share and develop ideas about the world. Also, the first recommendation in the EEF guidance report, Improving Literacy in Key Stage 1, with an evidence base that's identified as extensive, is develop pupils' speaking and listening skills and wider understanding of language. So it's well supported. The importance of oracy and language development is well supported by the research. Other research has suggested that there are cognitive gains across all subjects through effective use of dialogue and discussion, particularly in retaining subject-specific knowledge and transference of reasoning skills. We know that effective feedback is essential in helping children to learn well, and we also know that feedback's not as effective if it's done using only written feedback. Reformulation of questions and answers, explaining why and not just what, leaving lines of inquiry open are all important parts of effective feedback. So discussion and sharing of where children are in their understanding, what areas they've understood and what areas they need to work on next is fundamental to effective learning. And we also know how important metacognition is to effective learning, and good metacognitive practice includes teachers modelling for children the importance of thinking aloud. But we also know from research by the Communication Trust, for instance, that by the age of 5, 75% of children in persistent poverty are below average in language development, as opposed to about 35% of those not in persistent poverty. So developing good oracy is part and parcel of the mission to reduce educational disadvantage based on income. So talk, good oracy, dialogue and discussion are probably key to learning in general, but talk's also extremely important in the teaching and learning of maths specifically. Think about the purposes of talk. Here's a list of purposes for talk that come from the charity Voice 21, which exists to promote better oracy and dialogue in teaching and learning. How many of these are particularly important in teaching maths? Mathematical thinking is one of the 5 big ideas of pedagogy identified by the NCETM, the people behind Maths Hubs. They say that if taught ideas are to be understood deeply, they mustn't merely be passively received, but must be worked on by the pupils, thought about, reasoned with, and crucially, discussed with others. For instance, it's hard to think how children might unpick a conjecture, such as the idea that multiplying always makes a number larger, without discussing it in detail, considering a range of examples and different ideas. And the new DFE guidance as a part of each section, the language focus, that highlights on the important vocabulary and important STEM sentences for that concept or idea. Some of the evidence behind the EEF guidance report on early years and Key Stage 1 maths suggests that unpicking concepts through discussion and dialogue is really important. And of course, discussion is written into the national curriculum. But there are some barriers to the embedding of dialogue and discussion into maths teaching. In research by Millard and Menzies in 2016, 31% of teachers cited a lack of time to develop oracy. 25% were concerned that focusing on oracy would put off quieter children. And 20% felt that focusing on oracy would provoke disruptive behaviour. In reality, a focus on oracy, where the skills and rules of discussion are sensitively taught and not just expected, will help children who are quiet to develop an important life skill. And children who show low-level disruptive behaviour often do so because lessons don't give them anything to do. Also, asking them to focus on specific aspects of talk might help to give them a bit more direction in lessons. And other respondents were concerned that a focus on oracy would leave nothing to show for the work that they've done. Having perhaps less in books would be questioned by SLTs. And this chimes with Robin Alexander's research, which suggested that there's a greater emphasis on written work to the detriment of speaking and listening. This is our first big discussion point. Is what is written in the books more important than the actual learning? We need to be clear about the purpose of written questions. They're there to help you to assess what children have learned and what misconceptions they might have that you would need to work on next. They're not there to show that you haven't lazed about during the lesson or to fulfil some sort of checklist of activities. We need to look again at why we record things in books. Do we record too much? Do we record in every lesson because that's the school policy, regardless of whether it contributes to good learning? Do we record at the end of each lesson because that's what we've always done? One thing we've learned by looking at S-planning is that we can plan out in advance where it's important to record and where it's not. We might also consider, instead of the sort of traditional questions at the end of the lesson, we might consider journaling, writing down ideas during the lesson in a working out book, either individually or collaboratively, and then using that quick informal recording to provide quick assessment or material from which to progress the lesson. So, before going on to look at how we might develop and improve our approach to oracy, and I'm using that word to refer to speaking and listening, developing discussion and dialogue, and to adapt it to the new normal, let's look at how research suggests teachers have been approaching it so far. Robin Alexander makes the point that we value writing much more highly than we do oracy. In his research, he found that only about 10% of questions were open questions. We'll unpick what types of questions there are in a bit. And that in 15% of his lessons studied, no questions were asked at all. Probing by the teacher, where the teacher asked further questions and encouraged sustained and extended dialogue, occurred in just 11% of questioning exchanges. This comes back to the earlier discussion about the purposes of what's written in books and whether we might focus less on that. And I'm not saying that it's not important, but we do need to be really clear about why we're doing it and perhaps more on the importance of discussion and dialogue in our maths teaching. In his 2017 research, he found that the average question exchange lasts about 5 seconds. And the majority of answers, around about 70%, contain just 3 words. In their evaluation of dialogic teaching, the EEF found that a prevalent type of interaction between teachers and children was what they called teacher-led recitation, where the teacher asks a question, the pupil responds, and the teacher evaluates the answer. This tended to lead to very predictable answers and was of limited use in encouraging children to elaborate on their answers or develop points. The process is a bit like the teacher asking children to guess what they're thinking. In his earlier research, Ted Ragg found that just 8% of questions are what might be classified as higher order, questions which probe and ask children to consider bigger ideas in more depth, and 35% were factual recall questions, ones in which a simple 1 or 2 word answer would be given, not probing or developing understanding. So it's probably the case that despite most teachers saying that they think that good oracy is important, and despite it being a fundamental part of teaching and learning, talk, and in particular dialogic talk, has been underused and underdeveloped in most primary classrooms. In his research, Alexander concluded that questioning and discussion gave, in general, low cognitive challenge. This may get worse as a result of the pandemic, possibly pushing teachers to employ more sort of transmissive approaches, less dialogic and discussive approaches. So, if you agree that we can improve oracy and that it's under danger somewhat, let's talk about what a good one would look like, especially in the new situation where we may not be able to work as collaboratively as we might like. If you really want to delve into oracy and how it might look across all subjects, the best place to go at the moment seems to be the charity Voice 21, which has a number of schools across the country which have oracy as a main focus. And they've developed a really helpful oracy framework concentrating on 4 aspects of oracy: the physical, the cognitive, the linguistic, and the social and emotional. I briefly mentioned earlier open and closed questions. Open questions invite the respondent to expand on their answer, to give a fuller, more considered response. So an open question might be something like, what would happen if we, why do you think that? What do you think about Dave's answer? Why? Closed questions are those which elicit sort of short, less expansive answers like, what is 3 times 7? We definitely need to ask closed questions in a maths lesson, but we probably need to push the balance more in favour of open questions. We could also consider questions as lower order or higher order. Lower order questions would be those asking for less expansion and dialogue, and higher order questions those which ask children to think more deeply. An example of a lower order question might be, what is 3 times 7? And a higher order question might be, does a bigger numerator always mean a bigger fraction? Again, we might need to ask quite a lot of lower order questions, but we could move the balance more in favour of higher order questions, those that stimulate thinking. So instead of giving into the temptation of chalk and talk in the new normal, where children may not be able to work as collaboratively, even if they're sitting in lines, we can improve our teaching by attending to the balance of open and closed, lower and higher order questions. Others, such as Alexander and Newstrand, divide questions into authentic and test questions. Authentic questions are those for which the teacher doesn't have a pre-specified answer. They signal to the child that the teacher's interested in what they think and not just in how well they can either guess what's on the teacher's head or report some very specific thing. And that chimes really well with the recommendation in the EEF's guidance report on improving maths in Key Stages 2 and 3, that teachers should teach strategies for solving problems rather than just getting them to rehearse the correct answer. So we might give greater thought to whether some of the questions we use are designed for children to report a ready-made answer, or whether they are authentic questions, which we really want to know the answer to and which have a range of possibilities and strategies. For instance, we could ask, how can we make 6? And rather than focusing on one way, we might encourage children to discuss different ways of making 6. And if we look at a question such as, what is the product of 18 and 5, there are several different strategies. So just accepting the answer with one strategy, rounding to 20 and then adjusting, for instance, we might encourage discussion of different strategies, such as doubling the 5 and halving the 18. So we've looked at different types of questions, and Neil Mercer lays out a more comprehensive classification of types of talk in general. He suggests that talk can be cumulative, disputational, or exploratory. Cumulative talk in the classroom is where several children each make a point, but the points they make don't challenge each other. They sort of layer on each other. For instance, Sally might suggest an idea, and then when Dave is asked what he thinks, simply agrees with Sally. When asked to expand, he doesn't really expand, but effectively repeats what's already been said. In small group and paired discussions, this can actually embed misconceptions. And disputational talk is where children frequently disagree, but without giving out worked out reasons for their disagreement. So they're kind of thinking, oh yeah, no, I've got to sort of disagree, perhaps it's a good thing to disagree, but they're not really unpicking what's being spoken about properly. Children's views are not open to challenge and change, but they simply polarise in that type of talk. Exploratory talk is where children have a shared purpose to synthesise different ideas. That doesn't mean that they're seeking agreement all the time, just consensus about what the different ideas and strategies are that exist. It's based on respect for each other's point of view and where children accept that their point of view can be challenged. It's a deeper and extended type of talk. It keeps lines of inquiry open rather than shutting them down. It uses praise discriminately and appropriately and filters out habitual praise such as good girl, well done. It encourages good articulation of ideas and confidence. Disputational and cumulative talk are ways of children presenting their own view, whilst exploratory talk is a way of sorting out their own thoughts. We might consider whether the talk in our class is overwhelmingly one of these. Do we foster enough exploratory talk or allow disputational and more likely cumulative talk to dominate? And Alexander classified these different types of talk. Recapitulation is where what has gone before is summarised and reviewed. This is a useful type of talk that we could do more of. Elicitation is asking questions designed to stimulate recall. This is obviously a good type of talk to use, but perhaps overused in the classroom. It can become cued. That is, a question we ask may contain a heavy clue as to the expected answer, so that it becomes a sentence completion exercise. So 3 7s are, yes, 21. Repetition is repeating a pupil's answer back to them. I was part of Robin Alexander's 2000 research, and we were asked not to repeat children's answers back to them if we could. The reasoning was that we could be taking away the ownership of their ideas from them. Children tend to ignore what actual children say and wait for the children's reaction to see if it's correct or incorrect, acceptable or unacceptable as an answer. It was really hard to do to not repeat children's answers back to them. When we began, children would often say that they hadn't heard what another child had said in a discussion, but we soon realised that it was because they were used to ignoring each other and waiting for the teacher's reaction. As they got used to the idea that they would have to both speak and listen in a lesson, they paid much more attention. And Alexander suggested that exhortation is where children are encouraged to think or remember what had been done the day before. Okay, Dave, remember what we said about numerators and denominators yesterday? And this is of limited use in getting to children to examine different ideas and to get them to link with what they already know. And for Alexander, reformulation can include paraphrasing a child's response to make it accessible to the rest of the class, or to link it with what's gone on before, or to improve the way that it's expressed, perhaps by using more correct mathematical vocabulary. It's a useful way to develop ideas and children's contributions. You might accept their first answer freely, as you don't want children to feel inhibited, but then invite them to reframe it, to reformulate it by saying, okay, how can you say that again, but using more mathematical vocabulary? Or try to add in X or Y, allowing them to reformulate their response. So the good quality talk that we're striving for uses more open, higher order and authentic questions. It's reciprocal. Children and teachers listen to each other and share ideas. It's supportive. The classroom climate should really be one in which it's okay to make mistakes, and it's purposeful, with an idea of a goal in mind. It's exploratory, asking children to think more deeply and to examine others' points of view and connect with them positively. We're striving for a dialogic approach. But children won't just do dialogic teaching and learning. They'll need to be shown and helped with how to develop it, and that's the mission of the Voice 21 schools. Often children, those with good manners, think that it's rude to disagree, and that can lead to lots of unchallenging cumulative talk. They need to be helped to understand that disagreement is one way that we learn. But the rules of good speaking and listening need to be discussed, agreed on and practiced before children will use them naturally. When they're working in pairs or smaller groups, you can't listen to everyone's discussion, so a good grounding in what the rules and formats of discussion are and reminders to use them will help to ensure that more children are discussing effectively. So your talk rules might include each of the aspects of the Voice 21 Oracy framework. For instance, physical. When children are not used to taking responsibility for their talk in class, they can often be inaudible. You could have a rule that they've got to speak so that they can be heard by all in the class, especially now when they'll be speaking much more whole class than in small groups. And you might insist that they use full sentences, after modelling by you, of course. So if they don't use a full sentence, you might model the full sentence to them and then get them to model it back to you. You might have a signal that shows when they're ready to contribute, such as thumbs in. You might have a cognitive rule, such as using correct mathematical vocabulary. We ask children to understand and use words such and concepts such as phoning, grapheme and split digraph from reception onwards. So why not sum, difference, product, addend, etc. It takes a lot of repetition and use of a word, estimated at 24 repetitions by Newman and Wright, before a word is successfully remembered. There might be a linguistic rule or rules, such as using reasons to support statements, clarifying what each other have said, and seeking further information, building on each other's ideas rather than simply agreeing or restating them. And the rules, of course, should include social and emotional aspects, such as the idea that all are allowed and welcome to speak. The rules might also include that children could invite others to speak and contribute. What do you think, Dave? Children should come to a shared understanding, not necessarily agreement, but a consensus about what the different concepts and approaches and strategies are. And you might model this by perhaps saying that, I've noticed Dave hasn't spoken, so I'm going to invite him to say what he thinks. Children should also get used to being allowed some thinking time. 5 seconds can seem a long time to be thinking when you've been asked a question, and children can get a little bit embarrassed if they're given this time without explanation. They often think that if they can't answer straight away, then something's wrong. But explaining that you'll give them time to think, because we all need time to think before we speak, might help them to structure ideas better. And of course, it's okay to change your mind. In fact, praising changing their mind and modelling it. I was thinking this, but now I think this. That will help to show learning is not a fixed line and we need to work to get there. And of course, children need to be helped to work on active listening and to have it modelled, particularly by asking meaningful questions of the speaker, being shown how to paraphrase what the speaker said. So what I think you're saying, Dave, is that fractions with smaller denominators are larger in size. Is that always true? And summarising. So what I think we agree is that when the numerator is the same, the bigger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. And each of those aspects needs specific praise when it occurs. Well done, you spoke at just the right volume. Well done, you used the correct vocabulary. Great, you really helped me when you describe your strategy. And well done for inviting Dave to say what he thinks. So as we start a new and very different term, we might think about how we can improve the oracy in our maths classroom generally, and if there are difficulties in getting children talking and discussing in smaller groups, we might need to think about some of the things I've talked about, which we would find easier to organise in smaller groups and doing them whole class instead. We might think about some different ways of seating children that have some distance but are not just in lines, so be creative about it. Here are some possible examples. I've written a document that discusses how some Kagan structures might be adapted to the new situation, and that should be on the Inset Day page to download. Talk to your partner is a very common activity in most maths classes. It can lead to a simple reporting type discussion as opposed to negotiating a shared idea. So having a role for each participant. A suggests a strategy, B suggests why they think it will work or why they think it won't work, as well as some clearer directions about what exactly they're going to talk about in pairs and how they might structure the talk. That's often left to their own interpretation, resulting in some quite poor discussions when it's just exhorted to talk to your partner. When asking a question to the whole class, how do you choose who will answer? Children sometimes put their hand up even if they haven't got an idea at all about what they'll say when they do, and others know the answer and could add a lot to the discussion, but Miss never chooses them, so they get used to not putting their hand up. So hands up's not a great way to choose who to answer. Sometimes people use lolly sticks to randomly choose answerers, But I've seen this come unstuck many times, when the child's stick is pulled out who has absolutely no chance of answering the question and is possibly made to feel a little bit on the spot. I've even seen teachers manipulate which stick is pulled out. So you might think it's better to consider, given once you know your class really well, to consider who to answer which question first. You can then match the child to the level of difficulty of the question, so you're choosing who answers, and you know how likely they are to get the discussion going. If there's a child or a number of children who tend to hog the discussion and not let others have their say, whether in a whole class or a group, you might consider talk tokens. Each child has a set number and must use them, so every child must use their talk token and not say anything more once they've used theirs, so that evens it out a bit, makes it a bit more democratic. To avoid repeating back what children have said, you might get used to taking a child's answer and then asking another child what they thought of that answer. That's a great answer. What do you think of what Dave said, Sally? Initially, they might say that they didn't hear, but once they realise that it might be you, they tend to pay more attention. Then you might ask them to nominate someone. Is there someone that you think might have an idea about this? Or to get another one to summarise it. Sally, can you summarise where we are with this now? You've kicked off the discussion, but you're trying to get them to play it. Sentence stems are the beginnings of sentences that help them to frame how children might begin their contributions. They're important scaffolds for helping children to structure their answers and ideas. Stem sentences, the other way around, are short sentences and phrases that capture the essence of a concept. Children can be trained in the use of these gradually so that they include them in their repertoire, and not only for maths. I've put some examples and the context in which they might be useful on the Inset Day page to download. We're getting familiar with stem sentences from the spines now. They use correct mathematical vocabulary in an easily understood context. They can be used as wholes, then given as parts so that children can adapt them to different contexts, i.e. 16 hundredths is equal to something and something else, more hundredths, and they can be reversed. So instead of writing the sentence to fit the image, they could draw the image to fit the sentence. And you might use 2 or 3 different but similar ones for an image or context, and children have to find and identify the correct ones. All through discussion, debate and dialogue about those stem sentences and how they connect with the images, etc. Good questions can be asked in a baffling way. We're all familiar now with the idea that the working memory is small and we need to minimise extraneous cognitive load. We need to make sure that we think about this when we're asking questions and ensure that we match the context and detail of the question to the stage of learning of the children. We could use worked examples to model a process before asking them to consider it themselves. We might use partially worked examples as they gain more expertise. We might later use non-examples to see if they can explain why the example doesn't fit the concept. TAs can have a great role to play in developing oracy. You might look at the EEF guidance report on making best use of TAs. In that, they suggest ways that TAs can work with children so that they can begin with the least scaffolding, using prompting, then cluing, then modelling, then correcting. If TAs have been part of the discussion about how to improve oracy, the rules for talking and listening, and techniques such as minimising repetition, asking children to refer to each other's points of view rather than concentrating on the teacher, etc., then they can be a valuable resource in developing oracy as well as teachers and TAs modelling discussions between themselves. What do you think, Mrs. Smith? Well, I agree with the first part of what you said, but I disagree with this. So modelling that process of good discussion, good speaking and listening between the teacher and the TA, it can be really helpful and useful for children. What about early years specifically? Of course, dialogue and discussion are an integral part of good early years practice. And of course, the best place to start on working on good practice in speaking and listening. In 2004, the research by Iram Siraj, etc., which led to the report, The Effective Provision of Preschool Education, or EPI project, the findings that suggested that one of the most effective approaches to early years teaching included sustained shared thinking. They list some of the key aspects of this, and you can see that they include many of the elements that I've been talking about in terms of Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, are specifically identified in that EPI report as being really good practice in early years also. Another research, such as the EEF report on early years and Key Stage 1 maths, suggests using puppets to lead discussions so that any misconceptions can be attributed to and unpicked by the persona of the puppet. And of course using stories which have a maths element, such as one's a snail, ten's a crab, or ones to which a maths element can be sort of added, are really good ways to develop children's understanding of not only maths but their use of dialogue and discussion generally in the early years. So, in summary, developing oracy is an important part of teaching in general and maths in particular. It can of course take longer and often can become the whole lesson, but it is essential to good teaching and learning. It's fundamentally about the difference between delivering a ready-made lesson or curriculum and really teaching. We can see the current situation for the difficulties that it throws up, and there are many, but we can also see it as an opportunity to develop oracy in the class as a whole rather than just in small groups. We've suggested in September using the new DFE guidance should be done more through discussion and dialogue rather than testing, and this might be a good place to start to consider some of the ways that I've suggested to improve that oracy. Thanks. Bye.